Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrei Shevchenko, and on behalf of the team of ZMINA Center, Ukrinform, I want to thank all the journalists who tell the world about our fight for freedom. This time we're having a special event. Joining us in this studio is quite an impressive panel of human rights experts, and we will talk about different aspects in the area of human rights during full-scale aggression of Russian Federation. And I will start with Alyona Lunyova, who represents the ZMINA Human Rights Center, and you covered the topic of ratification of Rome Statute. What should we know about this subject? Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would just step back and say what kind of document is this? What's the document we prepared? The one that we're presenting today. It's a coalition of 8 charity funds who work with the aftermath of the armed aggression of Russian Federation against civil population. So we work with this subject for an extensive period, and we prepare the proposals to government agencies regarding the topics we work on. And in the beginning of the year, for the umpteenth time, we prepare a list of key steps to be undertaken by the state to make sure that the people who are affected by the conflict are protected to the maximum extent. The part of those recommendations are related to the activities of the Ukrainian parliament, and the other part is related to the activities of the Cabinet of Ministers. And this year, just like always, we start with the issues of responsibility, ratification of Roman Statute, and harmonization of Ukrainian legislation with the international legislation, because the primary issue is the matter of responsibility of Russian Federation, and we want this system to be efficient, and it will be efficient when it will be supported by legislation. So the first recommendation to the Ukrainian parliament is to ratify the Rome Statute and to make the criminal law of Ukraine comply with the criminal law of European countries. European Union. For example, Ukrainian legislation does not contemplate any punishment for the crimes against humanity, but we know that such crimes are committed by Russian armed forces and other military units engaged in the conflict on the side of Russian Federation. And as to ratification of Rome Statute, the government works very fruitfully with International Criminal Court, but it does not ratify its statute, which is in contrary to the general vision of for us to join the European family, and we want and we hope on the support of the International Criminal Court in terms of its investigation of the crimes committed by Russian Federation. So this step is quite necessary. Well, I will pass the mic to Anastasia Burau, who represents Right to Protection Charity Foundation. So for my understanding is that you're specialized in the compensation for those whose rights were infringed during the full-scale aggression. Good afternoon. Yes, we are specialized in those matters, and I want to emphasize 2 steps the government should pay attention to. First of all, is the identification of the categories of population who were affected by the war. As we know, the international armed conflict is going on starting from 2014, and it resulted in a huge number of affected people, either injured, dead, whose property was destroyed or damaged, missing in action, and prisoners of war. But due to the absence of the systematic identification of all the categories of population which were affected by the war, the government cannot create the systemic support for those who were affected by the war. And talking about the compensation, we would like to emphasize the following. As per the data of Kiev School of Economics, as of the end of 2022, 149 more than 149,000 residential buildings were either destroyed or damaged. It means dormitories, individual residential buildings, apartment blocks, which means a lot of people were left without the roof over their heads. So the issue of compensation for those affected in this way arises immediately. Before the war, there was a mechanism which was applied to the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, but it does not comply with all the challenges. It does not respond to all the challenges posed by the new phase of aggression. So the government has to develop the new mechanism which would be transparent and efficient for all those affected. And one of the initiatives aimed at that is the draft law 7198, which was developed early previous year, and only in the end of December last year there were tables developed for a second reading. We've seen the new edition in early this year of this draft, and there are discussions going on the fairness of all the articles of this law. We don't see this draft law as perfect because it has certain restrictions as to the categories of people who can be compensated for damaged property and as to the ways of such reimbursement. So we would like this procedure to be worked on better, so it covers all those affected, and to provide fair and just compensation for all those whose property was destroyed or damaged as a result of a full-scale aggression. I would like to pay attention to this document that you brought here. It contains 5 recommendations for Ukrainian parliament and 5 more recommendations to Ukrainian government. And in the first article I see the recommendations for Ukrainians who currently reside in temporarily occupied territories. How can we protect their rights? I would like to address this issue with Violeta Artemchuk, coordinator as Donbas SOS NGO. As to the people who reside in the temporarily occupied territories and as to the rights that we would need to protect, I would like to stop at 2 matters in more detail. Regardless the fact that the territories are temporarily occupied, it's the Ukrainian citizens who reside there, and their lives are going on. For example, in the occupied territories, they still bear children. Unfortunately, people keep dying in the temporarily occupied territories. There are divorces there, and there are marriages entered into. Currently, it's very difficult to leave the occupied territories, and the people living there, due to the lack of certain procedures, of legislative procedures, they cannot, for example, obtain the certificate of birth for their children, newly born children. Well, they can, but it's quite complicated because currently the issue of the issue for extending such birth certificate envisages that people have to leave the occupied territories, submit a number of documents based on which the court undertakes a resolution about the issue of such birth certificate or death certificate, and the relevant authorities issue such documents based on court's resolution. So it's difficult to leave those territories, it's difficult to find the relevant representatives, and the court procedure is not short either, which complicates the situation even more to get to obtain the documents of Ukrainian standard documents. So the newly born Ukrainians, they don't have birth certificates. I mean, those who are born in occupied territories, which can further on complicate the exercising by them of their civil rights. I cannot tell you the exact figure, but it's about 10,000 people who were not extended the birth certificates for their children for the time being. So we would like the situation to be facilitated, the procedure to be facilitated, and for it to have the administrative nature, so the people can apply not to the court but to the other agencies to obtain such type of documents. If I may add a few more words, that's my personal pain and maybe the pain for all of us. Another document which people are entitled to is the right to education. The war is going on for a number of years. Many people received higher education in the occupied territories, and now that they leave from the occupied territories to the territories under control of Ukrainian government, they cannot confirm their education, their qualification. I'm not talking about the diploma issued by a university or institute in Donbas region, but there should be a procedure developed and improved so that a person passes all the tests, passes all the necessary exams to obtain a Ukrainian standard diploma, and it affects the economy of Ukraine. There is a lack of qualified personnel, but these because in fact there is qualified personnel, but they cannot confirm their qualification. Well, let's talk about more dramatic events happening in occupied territories. In your documents, you mentioned that 149 people on occupied Crimea are now such that can be considered political prisoners, but we cannot estimate the exact number of such people. But what can the government do in this situation? I would like to address this situation with Anastasia Kalinina from Crimea SOS. I would like to pay attention to the laws that were already adopted, but they're not complied with. We're talking about the law on social protection of the people who were affected by the war. So here we're talking about the civilians who were imprisoned due to their pro-Ukrainian position, but it also covers not only civilians but the military as well. But there is no joint register for such persons, and we cannot account those people. Talking about Crimea, it's at least 149 people who were detained in occupied Crimea or Russian Federation. But talking about Donetsk and Lugansk regions, we don't have any numbers at all. It's thousands and thousands. And on the territories occupied after 24th of February 2022, there are more civil prisoners who might have been deported to Crimea or Russia, and since there is no this joint register of such persons, their families cannot receive any social aid, any legal aid whatsoever. And those missing in action, back in 2018 there was a law adopted on the legal status of the persons missing in action, but this law doesn't work at all. The International Commission for Missing in Action tells us about 15,000 people missing in action during Russian aggression. So if our organization documented at least 500 civilians missing in Kherson region only, starting from the full-scale invasion, we understand that the figure about 15,000 seems quite real, and we don't have proper mechanism of implementation of this legislation. We don't have a register of persons missing in action. We don't have an efficient system for their search, and as a result the families of those missing in action cannot receive any aid from the government that they would like to rely on. I would like to pass the mic to Yuliya Matviychuk, Advocacy Manager at East SOS. Can you tell us about the evacuation of such people? Thank you. After the beginning of full-scale invasion, the issue of evacuation of civil population from areas of active warfare and temporarily occupied territories became very active, and talking about further the occupation to ensure their security, we have to change the approach as currently implemented by the government. We offer 3 steps. First is coordination between the central government and local governments and civil organizations, international organizations. We should establish a dialogue for us to solve the current issues. Another step is the intense information campaign for those being evacuated. Many people remain there because they don't know where they go and if they would be able to get new jobs and so on. And the third step is the implementation of procedure of mandatory evacuation of children who still stay in the areas of active warfare and they are under everyday threat. Another issue is the change of approaches for disbursements to internally displaced persons. Talking in statistic language, there were 3 billion hryvnias allocated for such disbursements. And obviously such funds, they require control, and we have to change the approaches to their distribution and not to use discriminatory practices used before. For example, in 2023 it was decided to return to the practice of confirmation of residence of such people or temporary residence. So we offer to check the financial condition, for example, of such persons, but not to use practices which were considered discriminatory by the courts back in 2017. If there are any questions on the floor, please go ahead, dear colleagues. Anastasia Rakuta, Ukrinform, could you please tell us what are the steps already undertaken by the government to compensate the cost for damaged property to the citizens, and do you have any information how many citizens were already compensated such costs or where they moved to new residences? Thank you. I will try to answer this question. Talking about the damage which happened before the full-scale aggression, there was a mechanism in place and people were disbursed such funds. They were contemplated for compensation for destroyed property, not damage. There is a difference. And in the state budget, and for example last year, such funds were disbursed. There were committees working and this mechanism was in place and it was efficient. The information was provided by Ministry of Reintegration in their website. And talking about this year, the mechanism which existed before, it does not respond to the challenges of today. And in 2022 we see already that it's more about not the disbursements but as to the building of a new mechanism. The government adopted a resolution which regulate notice through the application about the damaged properties, about the destroyed property. The next step should be the adoption of law which would envisage the ways of compensation and options for the people, so it regulates the procedure in general. So we could see this mechanism work in reality, and we see that one of the ways is financing of construction. It's not that the funds are disbursed to the people, but the government allocates funds for the construction of new residential building or apartment, and we hope this process will end logically and the procedure will be adopted. More questions? My name is Tatiana, Civil Control Editorial. Do the law enforcement agencies abuse the article on collaborationists? Sometimes the disabled people are being regarded as spies for their texting on text messengers, or the mentally challenged people are registered as spies, for example. Well, thank you. Thank you for your question. Well, talking about the responsibility, we have to mention that the new articles which emerged in the criminal law, they still need improvement. I mean, those that emerged after the full-scale aggression. So on talking about collaboration, is difficult to talk about the abuse, because the article itself written in a way that makes all the people currently residing in the occupied territories can be considered liable, because those who support publicly in social media, if they support in occupation or they glorify the armed forces of Russian Federation, such people may be considered liable, as it can be seen as collaboration. Or people who continue to do business in the occupied territories and they communicate with the occupational administration, or they support the occupation in a way. So the article is worded in such a way that it's easy to bring anybody to liability, and there is space for abuse, really. And there was a number of attempts to amend this article. There is a number of initiatives, about 8 initiatives, that are aimed at detailization of collaborationist activity, and we studied this issue, and we see that currently there are problems with that, and we would like the government to change this article and to focus more on those whose activity really supports occupation, because the register of pre-court decision, pre-court investigations, we see the people brought to criminal liability for cooking, for example, for occupiers. And now that we have more than 65,000 war crimes, and resources of our court system should be focused on those crimes, we should be talking about prioritization of cases and focusing on the criminals whose activities were really supporting the occupation, who did everything to support the occupation, rather than those who just try to survive in those conditions. Yes, I would like to add that during our conversations, when we use the word abuse, we would rather talk about the purposefulness of punishment, because talking about abuse, we have to have more serious arguments for the cases that happened, the events that happened in life. Well, it's not the first time that I hear that you present some recommendations. Maybe you can give us more details about how this document was born, and is there any reaction from those whose this document is addressed to? Well, let's start with me. We will send out these documents to the people's deputies today. And in the beginning of February last year, we presented not the same, but the same format document, and all the recommendations, they remained actual. And it's our reality that the matter of protection of rights of affected persons is usually left beyond the attention of government agencies, and the war changed it, because we see the number of issues that are added to this agenda. They are currently in process of execution, and there is a goodwill on part of the government in implementation of these steps. For example, the identification of or verification of the cases of birth and death, so that there is progress in certain areas already, but we also deem it necessary to emphasize the importance of these resolutions for millions of our citizens. So this is why we present this list. I would like to add a couple of words. What we are going to do next. So those steps are not something new for either parliament or the government. Apart from working over this document, we were working for the whole year with the government agencies, and this is just the top of the iceberg. It's our consolidated position. Any more words from the coalition? Are there any more questions on the floor? I will have a question of philosophic nature. You're doing a very benign business, the rights of the Ukrainians affected by the war. So you are so demanding to the government, and there might be people who say that, do you address your claims in the right way? We should better think how to pose the claims against the direct aggressor. Well, it's correct. We have to account all the damage inflicted by the aggressor to our civil infrastructure, to residential buildings, to the people who were affected, to those who died. But at the same time, Ukraine, as a European country, has a homework to do everything possible so we could start this claim. We could start accounting all those damaged or destroyed cases, all the destroyed properties, destroyed buildings, and we have our citizens who remain in the occupied territories one way or another. So it's the responsibility of a government to have them obtain the document, because we cannot say that those people who were affected, that they were affected by the war and that they missed something. It's the responsibility of a government to have this document, and it's not even a matter of discussion. We will cooperate with the national government to make sure that the matters addressed with our government are solved, and we know that our government is capable of overcoming all those obstacles, and to make sure that those who are liable, for destruction of our property or the properties of our citizens, for the lives of our citizens, so that they are being brought to justice. Well, what we were talking about in all of our blogs, we were talking about the registers, we were talking about the lists, all the mechanisms that account the damaged property. It's all necessary to make sure that we're able to bring Russian Federation to liability, to justice, and we documented all and we advocated all for this specific purpose. Last question: is there any international experience that you see that could be used or would be purposeful to transfer to Ukrainian realities? So it's difficult to find an armed conflict which could be of similar nature. So whose experience, in your opinion, maybe some models where the countries really, the governments really did well in the field of protection of rights? Well, talking about compensation, really in a number of countries there were external and in some cases internal conflicts. There is relevant legislation in Turkey and Georgia, and really in many countries there were mechanisms for compensation, and we study, we research, we see, and we try to segregate the positive matters which could be useful for Ukraine. But given the scale of aggression, given the scale of invasion and destruction and the situation in general, Ukraine will probably need to look for and develop its experience based on international experience, but we cannot take their experience, so to say, in full. So we should go our way and we should develop our own solutions. I would like to mention again about the educational qualification. A part of Georgia, for example, is occupied, but in the occupied territories there are also people who obtain higher education. They study in universities, And for what I know, the diplomas are just recognized there. There is a procedure in place, so we're not talking about this example, but we're talking, for example, about extension of Ukrainian diplomas after a number of tests and examinations. We know that, for example, in Moldova there are Transnistria diplomas recognized, but we're not talking about this. We're just about verification of qualification. Well, about our way in terms of responsibility for and liability for war crimes, we're talking about the creation of international tribunal, special international tribunal, ad hoc tribunal. There is no such mechanism for punishment for war crimes. So there is no such experience that we could just copy and paste due to the scale, due to intensity of aggression, and to a number of other reasons. So I would rather hope on the support of our international partners, but it's good that they don't impose any approaches and they presume that the Ukrainian government will go their own way and find their own solutions given the context. Let it be unique, but it's the context we have to work with. Alyona Lunyova, Anastasia Burau, Violeta Artemchuk, Anastasia Kalinina, Yuliya Matviychuk, the coalition of NGOs acting in the area of protection of rights of those affected by the Russian aggression. There is a document, 10 priority steps in the area of human rights protection. Thank you for sharing this information. I invite all the journalists to follow our announcements. Stand with Ukraine.